I never thought guilt could feel heavier than heartbreak, but mine did. I carried it everywhere like a second skin. My last relationship ended because I cheated, and even though it was years ago, I punished myself daily. I told everyone I didn't want a relationship, that it was a distraction from my work. I spent weekends editing short documentaries, isolating myself, telling myself I didn't deserve anything simple or pure. Yet loneliness has a stubborn way of catching up to even the most self-imposed penance. Eva Laurent came into my life like a quiet, measured tide. I met her on a local arts forum where people shared short films and critiques. She was calm, soft-spoken, with an intelligence that didn't intimidate, it disarmed. We shared obscure French cinema, piano scores, and favorite quiet spots in the city. After a week of slow, careful messaging, she suggested a meetup at a small tea room perched over medieval rooftops. It felt old-fashioned, safe, grounded, the kind of love I told myself I'd earned if I ever did. The day was soft and cold, the streets dusted with snow. I arrived early, pacing the cobblestones, nerves tangled with anticipation. When Eva arrived, she carried herself with a gentle ease that made my pulse skip. We sat with mugs of steaming tea, and for 20 minutes I almost believed I was allowed to be happy again. She laughed easily, told me about rotations at the hospital, asked questions that cut deeper than surface chatter. I felt seen. Then she asked about my past, my family, regrets, personal losses, and I spilled everything. I told her about cheating, about hating myself afterward. I admitted it trembling, expecting judgment, but she didn't flinch. She listened with the calm of someone who knew more than they were letting on. My relief made me overshare. It wasn't until halfway through the evening that I noticed her shift, subtle as a dimming light. Her tone grew colder, deliberate, when she asked about loyalty and trust. I assumed she was cautious, a normal reaction. Guilt made me confess more, giving her every timeline, every detail I thought I had buried. I felt exposed, but still, I didn't suspect the truth. Not yet. I excused myself to the restroom, trying to calm the racing in my chest. My phone buzzed violently. Unknown number. I answered automatically, and my blood froze. "Alex, I'm so sorry. Your mother has been in an accident. They're trying to reach you. Please sit down." My vision narrowed. My chest collapsed. Snow blurred into streaks of white as I bolted outside, fumbling for my phone. I dialed my brother in a frenzy, heart pounding in my throat. "Hey man, what's wrong?" My brother answered casually. "What? Mom, there's been an accident. The hospital." He laughed lightly, confused. "Alex, Mom's fine. She's at home. We're having dinner." The world tilted. Every instinct screamed betrayal. My stomach dropped and my hands trembled. I looked toward the tea room window and saw her, Eva, standing there. Calm, watching, not concerned, not curious, just watching. Her lips parted slightly, like she might comfort me. But her eyes, they were cold, satisfied. She had engineered everything. I left. I didn't know where to go, my numb fingers clutching my coat. Snow crunched under my boots, loud and sharp. Each step felt like it echoed the humiliation she had crafted. She didn't need to speak. Her intentions were clear. This wasn't about coffee, cinema, or conversation. This was about control, observation, punishment, disguised as chance. By the time I reached the end of the street, the tea room was behind me. Every thought spun backward, remembering forums, conversations, every detail I had shared. Had she known about me before she reached out? Had she been waiting, planning? Fear mingled with shame. I realized I didn't just feel exposed. I had been baited, a meticulous psychological strike. That night I didn't sleep. I replayed the date over and over, trying to understand how I'd missed the signs. Her questions about trust, the quiet intensity when I admitted my past. Nothing was casual. She had mapped me, studied me, and orchestrated this moment perfectly. The next day, I scrolled through the forum history, looking for any clue I had overlooked. Every response, every interaction, suddenly felt like it had been planned. She knew me, or knew someone who knew me intimately. I called my best friend to talk it out, but words failed. Even saying them aloud made the fear grow. I felt unsafe in my own routines. Going back to the tea room, retracing my steps, it was impossible. I couldn't even imagine her face without the trace of that cruel satisfaction. My confidence, my sense of security, had been stripped away. I was alone, with the memory of a smile that didn't belong to kindness. I debated contacting her directly, confronting her. But I knew the truth. There was no resolution to this kind of violation. She had no obligation to confess, and I had no recourse. Some people act not for confrontation, but to claim power. She had claimed it over me in that single, orchestrated afternoon. I began locking down everything: phone numbers, social accounts, locations. I deleted every online profile, thinking maybe if I disappeared digitally, I could disappear psychologically as well. My work became my refuge. Editing, framing, telling other people's stories gave me distance from the story she had forced me into. But fear was persistent. I kept imagining her watching from corners, lingering shadows, movement in reflective windows. Every knock at my door, every ring of the phone, jolted me to immediate vigilance. I realized that this kind of control doesn't need physical presence. A single calculated act, a well-timed lie, can fracture reality more than any argument or fight ever could. I became careful, meticulous. I never went to the tea room again, avoided snow-dusted streets alone, double-checked locks. The ordinary became tactical, every interaction assessed for potential manipulation. She had taught me unwillingly that trust is fragile, that your mind can be invaded without your body ever being touched. Time passed. Life went on in small increments. I learned to walk past tea rooms without looking up, to carry myself with cautious composure. I met new people, slowly, carefully. Conversation became a skill of observation, trust no longer given freely. I thought often of her face, her satisfaction. And I realized that some people aren't interested in connection or care. Some people orchestrate pain with precision, using knowledge of your guilt, your shame, your weaknesses. Her performance wasn't a story about love. It was a story about control, and I had been cast unwillingly. I rebuilt myself slowly, aware that fear can't be banished entirely. But awareness became strength. I learned that not every act of kindness or interest is genuine, that some smiles hide motives designed to hurt, and that you can survive betrayal, even when it strikes like a perfectly executed psychological trap. Not every connection is sincere, and not every person with empathy is trustworthy. Guilt, shame, and openness can be weaponized by others, and survival requires vigilance, self-awareness, and the courage to protect your mind as carefully as your body. True safety comes from boundaries, discernment, and the refusal to let past mistakes be used against you. I used to think grief was a quiet companion, one that settled in the corners of your home and whispered in your ear during the nights you were alone. Losing Tom was like the ocean swallowing me whole, leaving fragments of myself stranded on a shore I didn't recognize. 6 years had passed since the boating accident, and I'd convinced myself I was rebuilding, slowly, piece by piece. My evenings were spent restoring old photographs, not because I hoped to relive the past, but because I wanted to remember it properly, to honor it. Friends kept telling me I should date, that maybe the world wasn't done with me yet, that my loneliness wasn't a permanent residence. I nodded, smiled politely, but I wasn't ready for romance, not the way they imagined it. I craved conversation, connection, someone to talk to about the ordinary and extraordinary, about grief and joy in equal measure. That's when I stumbled across Daniel Rourke. Photography forums aren't dangerous, or so I'd thought, but sometimes the right stranger lands in your life like a wave you don't expect. Daniel appeared one evening under a thread discussing faded Polaroids. He had this way of writing that felt intimate without being intrusive. "I've been archiving old photographs," he typed, "trying to keep memories alive, even the ones that hurt." My pulse quickened. That's all it took. One line, and I replied. One conversation led to another. Hours of voice notes late at night, where we shared stories of loss, laughter, small victories, and tiny heartbreaks. He was empathetic, disarming in a way that felt safe. He suggested a first date finally, a coffee by the harbor on a quiet Sunday afternoon. I almost canceled twice. Old habits of fear die hard. But there was something gentle in the way he insisted it would be casual, harmless. That morning, I was in the attic, shifting boxes, when I found a shoebox of old photographs. I'd forgotten half of what was in there. And then I saw it. A blurry snapshot of Tom laughing on the pier, his colleagues around him. Behind him, barely noticeable, was a man who looked exactly like Daniel. My stomach flipped. I tried to convince myself it was coincidence. People resembled each other all the time, right? I locked the shoebox away and forced myself to dress for the date, to tell myself this was just another small adventure, nothing more. But as I walked to the cafe, a prickle ran down my spine, something I couldn't shake. And when Daniel texted me again, telling me to grab a seat inside because he'd recognize me, I realized this wasn't just coincidence. He knew I was there. And somehow he had already seen me. I sat near the window, staring at the waves that stretched endlessly beyond the harbor, trying to calm my shaking hands. The wind fogged the glass, curling around my fingers like it knew my fear. 20 minutes passed, and still, Daniel hadn't arrived. My gaze kept flicking to the dark SUV across the street, engine running, windows up. The silhouette inside moved with purpose, watching. My pulse hammered in my ears. Then my phone buzzed. "Don't look nervous. You still wear your hair the same." I froze. My breath hitched. He had seen me. He had been watching. I wanted to scream, run, do something, anything, but my body refused. I glanced around. The cafe was calm, patrons sipping lattes, oblivious. I wasn't supposed to feel danger here, in this bright sunlit corner with seagulls cawing outside. And yet I did. I considered leaving, but curiosity anchored me. Maybe it was just paranoia. Maybe this was the man I had connected with for weeks. And then the SUV moved. Slowly, deliberately, it rolled down the street, parked behind a row of shops. I thought about calling the police, but my phone felt heavy in my bag. I felt trapped between wanting to be safe and wanting to understand who this man really was. When he finally appeared, his face familiar from the photos on the forum, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. He smiled, warm and easy, but there was something in his eyes, something calculating. "I'm sorry I'm late," he said softly, sliding into the chair across from me. "Traffic, you know?" I nodded, too wary to speak. Something in the set of his jaw, in the way he observed the cafe before meeting my eyes, made my skin crawl. "It's fine," I said cautiously. "I guess you know the harbor well?" He laughed lightly, a sound meant to disarm, but it didn't. It never did. Something in my gut told me this was the wrong kind of familiarity, the wrong kind of attention. We talked, carefully. I asked about his work, his family, the trivialities of life. He responded with just enough charm to make me relax, just enough warmth to make me think I might be safe. And yet every time I looked out the window, the shadow of that SUV lingered in my mind. He had seen me before. He had known I'd be here. And somehow, he had orchestrated it. By the time I left, I felt exhausted, hollow, exhilarated and terrified, all at once. I told myself I had imagined the SUV, the texts, the silent surveillance, but deep down, I knew I hadn't. Something had shifted. Something about Daniel was wrong. Back in my apartment, I paced the living room. The shoebox of photos sat on my desk, unopened, a silent accusation. I couldn't stop thinking about the man in the pier photo, about Daniel's timing, about that SUV. My phone buzzed again. "Did you enjoy our coffee?" My hands trembled. I typed a careful response. "Yes, it was nice." And immediately I wanted to delete it, hide it, burn the phone. I couldn't believe how easily I had trusted him, even after the photo, even after the SUV. My mind raced with scenarios. Maybe he was a twin of the man in the photograph. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe I was paranoid. The next morning, I received another message. "You left too early. I wanted to show you something." I didn't reply. I barely slept that night, haunted by the memory of him sitting across from me, calm and composed, watching. By midweek, my curiosity became obsession. I found myself checking the harbor cameras online, tracing paths, wondering if he had been tracking me all along. Then I discovered it, a small cafe receipt from the harbor cafe, time-stamped the same day we met. The name printed on the receipt matched Daniel Rourke, but below it there was another name, faint and smudged, D. Whitman. My pulse quickened. He had used another identity. Fear, icy and sharp, cut through the longing I had felt. Everything I thought I knew about him, the connection, the warmth, the empathy, was a lie. And worse, he had known where I was before I even sat down. My hope was gone, replaced by the realization that someone I trusted had been manipulating me, watching me, controlling the narrative without my knowledge. I couldn't sleep. Every creak in the apartment, every shadow beyond the blinds, became him. My mind twisted through every conversation, every voice note, trying to find the cracks where truth had leaked through the mask. And I began to understand, with a clarity that terrified me. I had been lured, carefully, intentionally, by a man who knew exactly what he was doing. I started researching him, cross-referencing photos, scouring archives, looking for anything that would confirm my fear. Every search led to dead ends, deleted accounts, fabricated histories, architects who had vanished, widowers whose obituaries were questionable, forums filled with empty usernames. And then I found a small obituary, a photo grainy and old. The man in it, the man who shared the same jawline, the same posture, the same hauntingly familiar eyes, was alive. The obituary was for someone else, a relative. Daniel Rourke was an alias, and I realized the man I had been speaking to was a stranger, someone who had studied me, waited for me, and inserted himself into my life with precision. I knew I needed to act, but I also knew the danger in overreacting. I contacted the police, showed them the messages, the receipt, the photos. They took notes, but hesitated. Without a physical confrontation, a crime was hard to prove. The feeling of helplessness was crushing. So I did what I could. I documented everything, changed routines, avoided the cafe, kept the photos close. Every knock at the door, every unknown number, made my chest tighten. I wasn't safe, but at least now I was aware. Awareness became my shield. Weeks passed. I didn't hear from him directly, but I felt his presence in small ways. A shadow lingering too long on a security camera, a car parked too close to my building, a fleeting figure in a park across the street. Fear became routine. I realized that some people, some predators, don't need to physically touch you to control your life. They can live in your mind, threading their power through your fears. One evening I sat with my shoebox of photos, and for the first time I let myself cry freely, not just for Tom, but for the illusion of trust, for the loss of naivety, for the knowledge that not everyone who smiles is safe. The lesson was bitter but necessary. People may appear warm, empathetic, even familiar, but trust must be earned carefully, not freely. Life continues, even when shadows follow, but awareness is the key to keeping them from overtaking you. I burned the shoebox that night, watching the smoke curl and fade. Some things, some people, are better left in the past. Some connections, however enticing, are meant to remain digital, never crossed into the tangible. I learned to hope again, cautiously. and to guard my heart without closing it entirely. The world is not always kind, but survival begins with knowing who, not what, you let inside. Not everyone who appears kind or empathetic is safe. True trust must be earned and verified, and personal boundaries are not just preference. They are protection. Awareness, caution, and self-preservation are as essential as hope and human connection. I moved to Portland in late spring, hoping a new city would help me breathe again. Toronto had become suffocating after my father passed unexpectedly 6 months prior. His apartment, his books, the echo of his voice in the hallways. It all lingered like a shadow I couldn't shake. I left behind friends, routines, the familiar smell of rain on Queen Street. I told myself I wanted a fresh start, a place where grief didn't seep into every corner of my apartment. I found a small loft above a flower shop in the Pearl District, rent just barely manageable on freelance work and odd illustration gigs. The space was modest, sunlit, with a wooden ladder to a tiny loft bedroom and exposed brick walls that smelled faintly of damp flowers. I spent my evenings sketching by the windows, pencil in hand, and listening to vinyl records I'd carried across the country. It was quiet, lonely, but safe. I liked safe. I hadn't dated in over a year, not since the breakup that had followed Dad's hospitalization. My friends reminded me gently that life wasn't just surviving, that I deserved something good. "You're ready for calm," my friend Lila said over coffee one afternoon. Calm, safe, kind. That's all I wanted. I wasn't looking for fireworks, just someone whose presence didn't leave a ringing tension in my chest. I downloaded a dating app half-heartedly, thinking it might be a distraction. I kept my profile honest but minimal. Freelance illustrator, loves coffee, prefers small hikes to crowded bars. When Lucas messaged me first, it was about local art studios, not my photos. I liked that restraint. Our conversations were soft and steady, full of laughter but never pressure. He spoke about his childhood, chaotic, messy, emotional, but without bitterness. "I've learned to manage what I can," he told me one evening. There was vulnerability in it, but not desperation. I admired that. After a week of messages, he suggested we meet for a quiet drink by the waterfront. I hesitated but agreed. When he arrived, he carried himself with calm confidence. He opened doors, pulled out my chair, remembered that I liked dry cider and sketching on napkins. It was all the little things that made the evening feel effortless. He asked questions that weren't invasive, listened with intent, and laughed gently at my stories. I allowed myself a small thought I hadn't entertained in months. Maybe this could be something good. And then it shifted. A man brushed past us near the bar, nothing unusual, barely a glance exchanged, and I saw Lucas's posture stiffen. His jaw flexed and his gaze followed the man with an intensity that didn't match the situation. I chalked it up to first date nerves. Maybe he was protective, careful. But there was something behind his eyes, something I couldn't name. I tried to ignore it, but the warmth I had felt only an hour before began to fray at the edges. He drove me home, insisting he just wanted to make sure nothing happened. I nodded, but unease settled in my stomach. He spoke lightly about disrespect, about men who didn't know boundaries. I told myself to stay calm. Maybe he was just eccentric. But as he smiled at me outside my building, there was a quiet edge, the kind that doesn't speak of charm. It spoke of ownership. I slept uneasily that night, my mind replaying his every word, every glance. The first date should have been easy, but I realized something crucial. Some men don't reveal the monster in anger. They reveal it in control. The next morning, I woke stiff, my apartment quiet except for the faint hum of the city outside. My sketches lay scattered across the table. I brewed coffee, hoping caffeine could steady the churn of my stomach. My phone buzzed. No message. Good. That gave me a small sense of relief. Over the next week, I replayed the evening over and over, questioning myself. Was I overreacting? First dates always come with nerves, right? I told myself that. I tried to remember the gentleness he had shown, the attentiveness, the interest in my work and habits. But then I remembered the way his gaze had sharpened, the tone when he spoke about other men, and I shivered. Something in him didn't just want to protect, it wanted to control. I confided in Lila. "He's nice," I said, but something felt off. She frowned. "Off how?" I shook my head. "It's not anger, not really. It's territorial, like he's already deciding who I belong to." She leaned back. "Then maybe trust that instinct. You can't unsee that." I tried to go about my work, sketching illustrations for a children's book and finishing a mural proposal. But every time my phone buzzed, I flinched. I found myself scanning my street as I left the loft, checking the corners of shops for lingering figures. It was irrational, I told myself, but the memory of his car parked outside, his gaze fixed on my door, lingered like a shadow. 3 days after the date, I made a decision. I changed my number. Not out of fear alone, but because I realized how easily boundaries could be crossed if I didn't act. I blocked him on the app, deleted messages, erased reminders of the night. The act of doing it felt empowering, like I was reclaiming some sense of autonomy I hadn't realized I'd ceded. That night, I walked home from the studio, lantern-lit streets quiet, and felt a twinge of relief. I thought of Lucas as a lesson in perception, how charm can hide intent, how attentiveness can hide obsession. I told myself I would be more careful, but I also acknowledged that fear was now part of my world. Not crippling, but alert, like a muscle learning to flex again. It was a lesson I hoped I never had to teach again. Some people don't reveal themselves through anger or overt acts. They reveal themselves through control. You recognize it, or it becomes a shadow that follows you. I would recognize it next time, but that didn't mean the unease left entirely. Even with my number changed, even with the app deleted, I carried a memory of the first flare, the subtle, almost imperceptible shift from attentiveness to ownership. It haunted me in quiet ways. A glance that lingered too long, a touch that felt less like kindness and more like testing a boundary. It made me realize that charm isn't always safe and that vigilance doesn't make you paranoid. It makes you alive. Weeks passed and I threw myself into work. My freelance projects became my anchor. I found a rhythm. Mornings at the loft, afternoons at the flower shop downstairs sketching new arrangements, evenings with a glass of wine and a notebook full of half-finished illustrations. Life felt safe again, predictable, like a calm sea after stormy tides. One afternoon, my neighbor Claire knocked on my door. "Hey, Savannah, you've got some mail. It's odd. No return address, just your name." I frowned and took the small envelope, tucking it on the counter. I didn't open it immediately, convincing myself it was bills or fan mail. But curiosity gnawed at me until, finally, I slid it open. Inside was a small card with neat, unfamiliar handwriting. "It was nice seeing you again." A cold spike ran through me. My hands shook, coffee forgotten. I reread it. Seeing me again? I checked the street, glanced up at windows. Nothing. My instincts flared, a memory from that first date resurfacing, the tightening of his jaw, the shadow behind his eyes. I stuffed the card in a drawer and told myself I was overreacting. Maybe someone knew my name from the building directory. Maybe it was coincidence. I tried to sketch, but lines shook on the page. The next day, my sketchpad disappeared from the counter, replaced with a small bouquet of white roses, tied with a ribbon. No note. I froze. My first reaction was disbelief. I called Claire to make sure it wasn't a delivery error. She assured me it wasn't hers. I spent the evening pacing, doors locked, lights dimmed. I didn't sleep well. Every creak of the loft made me flinch. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer than it should. I realized something uncomfortable. The feeling I had during that date wasn't paranoia. It was recognition. I knew what control looked like, even in its subtlest form. I called Lila. I think he's watching. Or maybe not even him, someone. I don't know. She sighed. Savannah, you don't owe anyone access to your life. You changed your number, your routines. You're already being careful. Trust yourself. I did, reluctantly. But that night, as the city lights glimmered through my window, I couldn't shake the image of that first date. The soft, warm tones that had slipped into something harder, leashed, like a cord tightening around my independence. That image became a lesson I carried silently. The first sign of ownership is subtle, often polite, and always dangerous. By the time summer ended, I had refined my awareness. I spoke to friends more openly about boundaries, about reading people carefully, about intuition. I still ventured out, cafes, galleries, evening walks, but I watched, always. The first flare of control never disguised itself fully once you had learned to see it. One evening while sketching in my loft, I saw a man across the street. He looked normal, even kindly, smiling at someone else's dog. But something about the way he shifted his weight, the brief way his eyes flicked toward my window, made my chest tighten. I blinked and he was gone. The thought lingered. He could be anywhere. Some people are patient and control doesn't need immediacy. It only needs time. I reinforced my safety. Door locks, alarm system, familiar routines. Yet even with preparation, attention lingered. The world felt smaller in some ways, less spontaneous. But it was the price of surviving observation, of surviving those first signs of control. I realized that boundaries are not just walls, they're muscles. They must be exercised consistently. Saying no, walking away, changing routines, refusing contact. These were not signs of fear, they were demonstrations of strength. The awareness I carried from Lucas's first date became a tool, not a burden. And yet, I couldn't forget the lesson hidden in that night, in his subtle shift. The real danger is never the obvious, loud anger. It's the quiet assertion of control disguised as kindness. Gentle hands, soft words, thoughtful gestures, they can be the first indicators of ownership. By autumn, I was cautious, but alive. I spoke to others about recognizing signs, sharing stories, emphasizing that intuition should not be dismissed. Awareness became my quiet armor. I had lost trust, yes, but gained vigilance, and with vigilance came freedom. 3 years later, I still think about him occasionally, though I never hear from him again. I've moved twice more, changed my routines, and I've learned the subtle art of noticing the first flare of possession. I've met people since, people who are genuinely kind, attentive, and respectful, and I approach them with eyes open, recognizing the difference between care and control. Life has continued. Freelance projects, gallery shows, quiet mornings with coffee on my balcony. I allow myself laughter and warmth again, but I never forget the edge that slipped across a first date. It's a lesson I carry, quietly, in the way I assess people, in the way I reinforce my autonomy, in the decisions I make without guilt. Some men never reveal the monster immediately. They show it in subtle shifts, in controlled gestures, in the unspoken ownership that masquerades as protection. Recognizing it early can save years of fear, sleepless nights, and the erosion of self. I keep my doors locked, my numbers private, my intuition sharp. But I am free. I am still me, and I will not allow control to masquerade as kindness again. The first flare of control is always the first warning. Listen to it. Act on it. Your safety and independence are yours, and they are never negotiable. I've always been the type of person who observed life more than I lived it. At 24, I was done with the whirlwind of reckless relationships. My friends joked that I was too careful or picky, but after years of heartbreak and moments where trust was taken for granted, I wanted something different. I had a small routine. Mornings at the cafe down the street with a cup of dark roast, afternoons sketching the world outside my apartment window, and evenings spinning old vinyl records on my turntable. Life felt manageable that way. predictable, safe. Until one night, after a particularly long day at the gallery, I found myself scrolling through a dating app I had sworn off months ago. My thumb hesitated over the install button. I'd avoided the apps because of bad experiences, men who wanted the thrill but not the depth. But maybe I was ready to try again. My friends assured me that meeting someone online wasn't inherently dangerous and that real connections could happen anywhere. It wasn't long before I matched with Ben. His profile was simple, genuine pictures of him hiking, fixing cars, laughing with friends, a few classic movies listed as favorites. There was nothing flashy, no boasting about wealth or adventure trips. It felt honest. His bio ended with, "Simple days, hard work, and finding peace in the little things." That line alone made me pause. I swiped right. We arranged our first date at a quiet sports bar in downtown Austin. I remember walking in, feeling nervous, but strangely calm. Ben was there early, leaning against a high table with that easy smile of his. He wore a vintage leather jacket that looked lived in, jeans slightly worn at the knees, and sneakers dusted from a weekend hike. We shook hands, and he pulled out my chair. The conversation started casually. Movies, favorite foods, childhood memories. But there was a rhythm to it, a comfort. He spoke of his childhood outside the city, helping in his father's garage, learning to fix things with patience. I told him about my sketches, my favorite artists, and my quiet life routines. There was no rush, no pressure, just a shared connection. At some point, he suggested we grab a nightcap at his apartment. Normally, I would have declined, but there was a calm confidence about him that made me feel safe. The place was on the outskirts of town. He joked about the heavy iron bars on the windows and the multiple security locks, saying, "Neighborhoods changed over the years." Something about it felt slightly off, but I shrugged it away. After all, people have their reasons. Ben's apartment was unlike anything I expected. At first glance, it looked lived in, but then I noticed the walls lined with boxes and industrial-sized vacuum bags. It wasn't chaos, it was meticulous, organized, but for some reason my stomach sank. I didn't want to assume the worst. "Just supplies for my shop," he said when he noticed my glance. "Extra parts, bulk orders, being practical." I nodded, taking a sip of my drink, trying to focus on him, on the easy rhythm of his voice. As the night progressed, Ben's charm started to shift into intensity. He leaned closer, talking about the auto shop in ways I hadn't anticipated. "Cars carry secrets," he said, voice low, almost conspiratorial. "Sometimes it's not the engine, it's the things people hide inside." He smiled, but it was sharp, like a blade. My heart started to beat faster, a subtle warning echoing in my chest. Then the roommate entered, tall, speaking in a language I didn't recognize, eyes that lingered too long on me. Ben introduced him quickly as a business partner, but I could feel the room constrict, the air heavy. Their conversation was short, but their shared glances felt deliberate, like they were weighing me, measuring how I fit into something I didn't understand. When Ben returned, his words grew stranger. He showed me plastic baggies, scales, phones with multiple SIM cards. "Just side work," he said casually, almost laughing. But the unease had taken root. I realized that this wasn't about fixing cars anymore. It was something else. My gut screamed at me, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was harmless, maybe he was just eccentric, maybe. But I knew enough about my instincts to understand when to leave. I excused myself to the bathroom under the pretense of freshening up, and my hands were shaking as I locked the door behind me. I tried to formulate a plan to figure out how to leave without alarming him. The layout of the apartment was confusing, but I remembered the route we had taken from the entrance. Quietly, I eased the door open and slipped into the dimly lit corridor. My shoes made no sound on the concrete floor as I crept toward the back door. Outside, the alley was narrow and shadowed. I paused, taking a breath of the cool night air, and tried to steady myself. I felt like a character in one of those thriller novels I like to read, the kind where a single wrong move could change everything. But I wasn't a character. I was real, and I had to get out alive. My pulse raced as I ran toward my car, each step echoing against the brick walls. When I finally slid into the driver's seat and locked the doors, my hands were trembling so badly I could barely insert the key into the ignition. Driving home, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him following, half expecting the world itself to conspire against me. But nothing came. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I was exhausted, not physically but mentally. I deleted my dating profile on the spot and blocked his number. I didn't know what he did, or how far it went, but I knew I had narrowly escaped something dangerous. The weeks that followed were surreal. I tried to return to normal life, morning coffees, sketching, spinning vinyl, but the unease lingered. News alerts pinged on my phone one morning, and my stomach dropped. A drug bust at an auto shop on the outskirts of Austin, hundreds of pounds of narcotics hidden in car parts. And there it was, Ben's name. I sat frozen, staring at the screen. Everything I had seen, felt, and feared was real. I replayed the night in my mind repeatedly. The boxes, the vacuum bags, the plastic baggies, the roommate's gaze. I had been inches away from stepping into something I wasn't prepared to handle, something that could have ruined my life. I realized how easily charm and kindness can mask danger, how calculated normalcy can be used to lure someone into a trap. I shared the story with a close friend later, trying to untangle my emotions, and she said something that stuck. The red flags are never wrong. They're just uncomfortable because they tell you what you don't want to see. I haven't used dating apps since that night. I meet people slowly, in coffee shops, bookstores, or galleries. I still want connection, companionship, but I've learned that safety, physical and emotional, is non-negotiable. I take my instincts seriously now, and I don't ignore that little voice that whispers warnings. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't left when I did. I shiver at the thought, but I try not to dwell on it. Life is too short to be frozen in fear, but short enough to know when to respect your limits. And yet, there's also gratitude. I escaped because I trusted myself enough to act, even when I felt awkward or guilty. The experience taught me to balance hope with caution, trust with vigilance. I sketch more than ever now, and sometimes, while tracing lines of light across a city skyline, I think about how fragile choices can be, and how powerful it is to honor them. Trust your instincts, recognize red flags, and prioritize your safety. Charm and appearances can be deceiving, but self-awareness and caution can save your life. I've always believed that travel changes you, but it doesn't necessarily free you. At 33, I had lived quietly, photographing cities, people, and the subtle ways freedom shows itself in everyday gestures. After a messy breakup in Boston, I had sworn off love. I told myself it wasn't about avoiding someone. It was about avoiding myself, avoiding the pain of wanting someone who might belong more to another life than to me. Photography had been my refuge, my way of knowing the world without exposing my own fragility. I was in Istanbul, 3 months alone, trying to capture women and freedom in modern cities. The idea was simple: to photograph women in moments that revealed choice, or the lack of it, in their lives. I wandered streets, markets, and quiet bookshops, not looking for connection, but occasionally hoping for a story that would leave me breathless. I met Layla on one of those ordinary afternoons that suddenly felt extraordinary. The bookshop was tucked against the Bosphorus, a quiet corner where tourists rarely ventured. She was standing by the political history section, holding a thin book I had recognized only because I'd read it in college. She wasn't hidden exactly. She carried herself with quiet restraint, like someone who had learned to occupy the world without being seen. I approached politely. "Interesting choice," I said, nodding toward the book. She looked up, startled, then studied me with careful curiosity. "It's important," she said softly. Her voice carried something delicate but urgent, a kind of sadness that wasn't posed. "Do you ever photograph moments of choice?" she asked, almost pleading. I smiled, sensing something rare in her gaze. I try. I want to show what people have, or what they lack. She nodded, not satisfied with my words, but accepting them for now. That was enough to start talking, slowly, cautiously, until the conversation became genuine. I learned that she had lived her entire life within boundaries set by others. Every sentence she spoke about herself felt measured, like she was borrowing each word from a world she wasn't allowed to inhabit. She was elegant, reserved, intelligent, and quietly desperate to understand what freedom could look like. We agreed to meet for tea on a rooftop terrace that evening. When she arrived, the sunset painted minarets gold, the city glowing like it had secrets it didn't intend to reveal. Layla sat facing the city, her fingers curled around the teacup as if the warmth might hold her together. She asked me about choice, about life, about whether my family had ever dictated who I could love. It wasn't curiosity. It was envy. I noticed the way she checked over her shoulder, the way her attention fractured every few moments. A black sedan paused down the street and she froze, tense, calculating. I realized then, as the light hit her face, that she wasn't on a date. She was borrowing time. I remember the terrace as if it existed outside of time. The sun sank behind the Bosphorus, and the city began to twinkle in soft golden lights. Layla asked me more questions than I had ever been asked by someone who was barely 20 minutes into knowing me. "Do you get to decide who you spend your life with?" she asked quietly. Her voice wasn't accusatory. It was a whisper layered with longing, like she had learned to ask only what she dared hope might be true. I hesitated. "Sometimes," I said. "Sometimes it's complicated, but for the most part, yes. We have a choice." She exhaled slowly, as if I'd confirmed something she already feared. Then she looked down at the cup, turning it in her hands. "They don't approve of change," she said softly, almost to herself. I didn't press. There was a boundary, invisible but unmistakable, that I had learned not to cross. During our walk to the tram afterward, I noticed the subtle ways she moved, watching, measuring, bracing for invisible threats. A man across the street lifted his phone. Not texting, not scrolling, recording. Layla turned sharply, hiding her face, and I could see her muscles tighten. That's when I understood. This wasn't disapproval. This was surveillance. "Are you okay?" I asked. She forced a small smile, fragile and precise. "I'm fine. Really." But the tension in her shoulders, the way she didn't meet my eyes, betrayed the truth. She was trapped in ways I could not help her navigate. I wanted to tell her it would be okay, that she could leave, but I knew it wasn't my place. She could leave in theory, but not in practice. We parted that night under the dim tram lights. She said, quietly, almost as an afterthought, "If I disappear, remember that I wanted to stay." Her eyes were soft, edged with grief. I nodded, unable to respond adequately, feeling the weight of her words press into my chest. The next morning, I woke to the emptiness of her absence. I tried to call, tried to message, but the number had been deactivated. I went to the little bookshop where we had met, hoping for some trace, some clue. The staff was polite but vague. She had transferred permanently. When I asked what that meant, they shrugged. "Her family," they said. That was it. The words felt more like a verdict than an explanation. I wandered the city in a haze, revisiting the terrace, retracing our steps along the tram lines, staring at the black sedan parked silently at corners I remembered her noticing. I thought about the brief moments we shared, her questions, her curiosity, her careful smiles. Everything felt layered in danger, every gesture tinged with the reality of control she could not escape. I realized how rare trust is when someone's entire life is monitored. It isn't fear that binds them, it's invisible chains, the weight of expectation, the knowledge that any choice might be punished. And yet, in those brief hours, she had given me fragments of herself, enough to see her humanity, enough to mourn the freedom she would never fully claim. At night, I began photographing her face from memory, sketching light across her profile as if to preserve the fleeting sense of autonomy she had offered. I never photographed her directly. One photograph existed in my mind alone, unposed, unflinching, a witness to the brief moment she belonged to herself. Weeks later, I learned from news reports and whispers among locals that some young women in the city vanished quietly, their departures explained as family arrangements. No arrests, no complaints, no public record. Their freedom is erased quietly, methodically. Layla's story fit this pattern exactly. I thought about the moment she had frozen at the sight of the sedan, the way her hands clutched the teacup as if it could shield her, the whispered warning she had given me. I realized I had witnessed both courage and surrender simultaneously. She had chosen to exist fully in that rooftop hour, knowing the price she might pay afterward. I couldn't intervene, and I couldn't forget. Each frame I captured for my project afterward carried her shadow, a reminder that freedom is not only about choice but also about circumstance. I learned that sometimes the most profound stories are the ones you can't save. I keep her memory carefully like a photograph no one else can see. She never smiled for the camera, never posed. She simply existed, brief and luminous, a reminder of what it means to desire life fully, yet be denied it. I tell myself that by remembering her, by preserving that memory in my work, she is still partially free. I've learned to honor boundaries, to witness without claiming, and to understand the subtle weight of control that exists in lives constrained by others. Love and freedom aren't always intertwined. Sometimes they exist in moments borrowed between surveillance and expectation, in teacups held too tightly, in glances cast over shoulders. The world is not always safe, and even the most intelligent, careful gestures can be policed by forces beyond our sight. But compassion, observation, and respect for autonomy, even when powerless, are vital. Witness the truth, preserve it, and never forget that freedom is not guaranteed, even to those who yearn for it most. Respect the autonomy of others, recognize the invisible constraints they may face, and honor their courage and choices, even if the world cannot. Witnessing and remembering is a form of protection and understanding when intervention isn't possible. I've always liked control, not in the obsessive sense, but in the quiet architectural way. Lines and shapes, spaces that made sense, routines that fit together like bricks in a well-built wall. I lived alone on the top floor of an old apartment overlooking the frozen river. The city hummed beneath the ice, muffled, distant, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. After my last relationship ended, I swore off intimacy. It wasn't that I didn't want love. It was that I was tired of feeling like a caretaker, like my own needs came second to a person who might never be whole enough to be with me. Emotional distance became my safety net. I stayed offline. I avoided social media and dating apps. I followed the quiet rhythm of my life. Morning coffee by the window, sketching floor plans for imaginary clients, rearranging furniture for perspective, and sleeping with the curtains open to the city's pale light. It was predictable. It was safe. And then I downloaded a small app for introverts, a tiny, niche corner of the internet where people like me could meet without crowds, without pretense. That's how I met Mara. She was soft-spoken, gentle in the way she moved and spoke, almost hesitant in the spaces she occupied. Her profile mentioned that she studied contemporary literature, preferred quiet nights, and avoided crowded spaces. She had social anxiety, she admitted, though she didn't dramatize it. She simply stated it, a fact like listing your favorite color. When she suggested a first date somewhere private, a cozy evening inn, it didn't strike me as odd. In fact, it sounded peaceful, almost ideal. When she arrived, the storm outside was already brewing. Snow swirled against the windows like it had its own agenda. We ordered dinner, talked quietly, and watched the city disappear under white flakes. She didn't overshare, didn't flirt aggressively. She observed, tilting her head slightly every time I said something personal, cataloging me in ways I couldn't name. I felt seen, yes, but not comforted. There was a presence there, too precise, too constant, and I couldn't tell whether it was curiosity or something colder. The first strange moment came when she wandered into the kitchen, opening drawers, pulling out utensils, glancing at the organization of shelves. I didn't stop her, assuming it was anxious curiosity, a way of anchoring herself. But then she turned, looked at me, and said softly, "I just like knowing where everything is. It makes me feel safe." The way she said it made my chest tighten. That wasn't normal. That wasn't a person borrowing space temporarily. That was someone mapping it, memorizing it. I told myself I was overthinking. She was fragile. The storm was worse now, and I suggested she stay. It seemed safe enough. But when the apartment settled into night, I couldn't shake the tension, that quiet unease I had ignored in favor of politeness. Something about her felt like a shadow I didn't understand. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to a faint sound, fabric brushing against the corner of the room. I thought at first it was a dream. I blinked, and there she was, standing motionless, facing the wall, arms hanging slack, like she had become part of the shadows themselves. My pulse hit the ceiling. "Mara," I whispered. No response. I moved closer, and when I reached out to touch her shoulder, she pivoted sharply. Her eyes were empty, unfocused, and then she began striking my arms and chest, not yelling, not crying, just hitting with a precision that was mechanical, deliberate. My hands went up reflexively, trying to shield myself, but it didn't register with her. I felt panic twist through me like a blade. Then, as suddenly as it started, she stopped. She walked past me silently, gathered her coat and bag, and left the room without a word. I froze. My breath came in ragged bursts. When I noticed the smell, sharp, chemical, gut churning, I realized it was coming from the bathroom. I opened the door and my stomach dropped. The mirror was smeared with human waste, streaked in symbols I couldn't recognize. The shower curtain had been sliced straight down the middle, like a violent slash across the room. She hadn't left a message. She hadn't said goodbye. She had only violated the space I trusted. By the time I reached the hallway, the stairwell door was swinging shut. I ran to my phone, shaking, trying to make sense of something that had no sense at all. The police took a report, but with no name, no real identity, and no clues about how to find her, there was little they could do. The next day, I opened the app. Her profile was gone. Every message, every photo erased. It was as if she had never existed. I walked through my apartment again, checking locks, doors, windows. Everything felt exposed, wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she had mapped it all. Every corner, every weak point. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she had a severe mental health issue. Maybe the storm had triggered some episode. Maybe she wasn't dangerous, just unpredictable. But logic didn't soothe the unease. At night, I heard faint sounds, scratches along the wall, the hum of the elevator stopping on my floor when I wasn't expecting it. I checked the bolt, locked doors, called the police again, but nothing ever materialized. She wasn't there, yet the apartment carried her shadow. I began taking notes, marking times when noises occurred, trying to see patterns. At 3:07 a.m., like clockwork, someone tested the door handle. Slow, deliberate, no knocking, just pressure, as if measuring resistance. I held my breath, heart hammering, and then it faded. But I knew it wasn't coincidence. She had learned everything about the layout, the locks, the routines. I was trapped in my own home with her memory, or perhaps her presence lingering. I realized then that this wasn't about her needing help. This wasn't about me or my kindness. This was about control. I had invited a stranger into my life and my space, and for one night, she had taken more than I could have imagined. She had entered my apartment like a ghost, cataloging every inch, testing every boundary, and disappearing before consequences could catch her. I couldn't sleep without triple-checking locks, I couldn't leave a light on without thinking someone might notice. My world shrank, not because she was physically present, but because her presence had left marks in my mind. The storm outside had passed weeks ago, but I still felt it in my apartment, the silence broken only by a subtle sense of surveillance. I even began photographing my own apartment, corners, doors, layouts, not for art, but for memory, precaution. Each photo reminded me that what we invite in can leave traces long after the person is gone, sometimes without a name, sometimes without reason. Months passed. The apartment remained intact physically, but the unease never left. I no longer trusted quiet evenings, no longer trusted the soft fall of snow outside the window. Occasionally, the elevator would stop on my floor without opening. I would freeze, listening. Sometimes I imagined her, cataloging the doors again, watching. Sometimes I wondered if I would ever understand the motive, the sudden intrusion, the precision of it all. I learned the hard way that kindness has limits, and that trust can be exploited in subtle, terrifying ways. Not everyone who seems fragile is harmless. Some people enter our lives to map, to measure, and then vanish, leaving us to wonder if we were ever safe at all. Boundaries exist for a reason. Inviting someone into your space, and even gently, even politely, carries risk. Protect yourself. Respect your own limits. Trust intuition over politeness. And remember, some people leave marks not because they care, but because they can.